Here we are, 2018, August, almost 60 years since the Congo Protestant University was founded, and 20-some years when the North American Support Group was founded. So it's a good time to review what happened and perhaps trigger some discussion on what might be the proper and more interesting way of going ahead in the future on the support group. Let me first start with some of the history of universities in general, because the Apostle Paul, even himself, when he stops at Athens, he is having a discussion with a group of intellectuals there. He doesn't stay, he doesn't go very far, but some 300 years later, the Christian church was becoming strong in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, and it became a very strong church in the Western world, what we now call Europe and North America. This Western tradition of Christendom had a kind of an evolution which moved from the local bishop, who said, oh, we need to discuss this theology that the Apostle Paul and other scriptures have given, and we need to discuss this and make a doctrinal statement. And that's the beginning of many factions throughout Christianity, basically moving around the coming of Jesus as the Messiah, but it triggered a lot of moral and ethical questions in daily living. That's the beginning of these groups that got together. You have in the 13th century the beginning of what they call a university. Thomas Aquinas wrote a lot of his theological statements in the beginning days of the Paris University. Even today, when you go to Oxford and Cambridge, you have biblical names. You have Magdalene College, you have Jesus College, you have all kinds of colleges which were founded by various factions around one center. Gradually, the discussion went beyond Scripture, went beyond the neighborhood, and they said, now wait a minute, how does this all tie in with the universe and the universe around us? And it was during the whole scientific discoveries that came in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, and the industrialization that came in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, and the technology that has come since then, has become a question of the universe. That's the beginning of the use of the term university. We will discuss and study everything. Now that was the beginning. It was a Western idea which has since been adopted by Buddhists and others in Eastern countries and elsewhere. They now have universities, but the beginning of an agglomeration, bringing the various faculties together for a universal discussion was the beginning of it. Now, the interesting thing about the Congo University was it too had its roots in missionary work. But you have to go back to the political discussions of the Europeans who got together in 1885, called together by Bismarck, who by then was the leading politician of Germany, and they had very little of the African continent, yet everybody wanted to get into the African continent because the French and the Americans were not there. The French were already there. British were there. The Portuguese had stopped early as they went around the Cape. But now Germany was interested, and they didn't know what to do with Central Africa. Who would get Central Africa? King Leopold said, I'll take it. And they said, oh, no, you can't take that. No, this has to be done by a country. But nobody would give it to anyone else. It was too big. Stanley had made discoveries. Brazza on the other side of the Congo River had made discoveries, and they needed to decide how to do it. But the more they discussed it, the more they said, But Leopold says he will make this a donation. He will do this as a way to open up Central Africa, which will be a country for all. Now, he then eventually got into a lot of trouble on gathering rubber and in treating of the locals, and many histories are written on that. Eventually, a year before he died in 1909, 1908, the government of the country of Belgium, this little country, said, okay, we're willing to take over the colony. And the support naturally was, they had broken off from the Netherlands because they were basically a Catholic country. And the Netherlands was basically a Protestant country. So Belgium, when they took it over, they said, fine, we will take over and we will support the Catholic missions. Now, when they started, shortly after Stanley had done his run all the way up the Congo River, already the British Baptists were there. They were, within a matter of months, they were there. And they gradually attracted other missions, and gradually over the next 20 years, 25 years, by the time you come to from 1885 till 1915, so let's say about 40 years, you have many missions, Swedish missions, you have a lot of North American missions, going in there all over, sometimes right next to another Catholic mission. But this was part of the deal, that they would allow others to come in. This was not strictly Belgium alone. So under that cape of under Leopold, there was an entry that all could come. Gradually, Belgium took over. They gave a lot of support to the Catholics, but not to the Protestants. They were welcome, but they didn't get official assistance. Now, as these various missions developed their schools, hospitals, usually you have 2 or 3 main thrusts of the missionaries. It's gospel, preaching, visiting, being with young trainees that are going to be pastors in the villages. You have education, training of children. You have medical care. Sometimes you have little artisan shops, little industry, moving in agriculture, showing them certain crops, what they could do. This is part of broadening the ministry. It was after the Second World War, in 1945, that the socialists won the election in Belgium, and that had immediate implications on support also to the Protestants. Not that they were that strongly themselves Christian or Protestant, but they wanted to show competition with the Catholics. They continued to do the Catholic support, but they opened it up for the Protestants. So in that context, there was now a possibility. The 15 years between 1945, the close of the Second World War, and independence of 1916, only 15 years, there was a massive expansion of Protestant and Catholic education in the Congo. And gradually, that was immediately changed and even more expanded after independence. I remember when my wife and I, Elfrida and I, we went out to the Congo. We were under a Mennonite mission, and I became the director of a small teacher training school. Just then, a few of the graduates of high school had come to be my colleagues on campus, and we started sharing our office. I gave them responsibilities, handle the money, do things, and this is a transition towards giving more and more authority and more complicated decision-making for the African leadership. This is part of the educational process. In that, just the year before independence, speaking of Africa as a whole, the colonies were there really only over a 75-year period. By 1957-58 to 1962, over a 5-year period, you have most of Africa becoming independent. Still ties to the old colonial powers, where you have to the French and to the English and to the Portuguese and even to the Germans early, but Germany had lost its colonies after the First World War. And much of Tanzania, Cameroon, Togo, they were divided between Britain and France after the First World War. However, and that is part of our discussion also today, is why did Germany become involved in supporting the Protestants of the Congo? Now, 1959, this is still before independence, 1 year, the Congo Protestant Council said, you know, we ought to have a joint higher school of theology training to train pastors that will train pastors. We need teachers of pastors. We need a university level school of theology. And they did so. Congo Protestant Council was a unique entity. Even today, you have now called the result of the Congo Protestant Council become the Église du Christ au Congo, which is the Church of Christ in Congo, which is the Protestant Church of the Congo. Some 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the Congo Protestant University put out his slogan, "An education to build a nation." Now, that is important to recognize that part of the chaos was, and still remains, that there were very few university students, graduates, that were ready to take over leadership. There were at Loewen under Monseigneur Gillon, who was a great friend of the Protestant University, even though he was head of the Catholic one. He was a great friend of mine, too. They had only some 8, 9 qualified high school graduates in the first classes. There just weren't. I taught in the Congo Polytechnic Institute for 3 years from 61 to 64 because there were so few high school graduates that qualified to get to university. So that was a question of numbers. But what the Congo Independent did was, instead of just having 2 or 3 universities, as the Belgian colony had done, they had started a Catholic school in 1954 in Kinshasa, 6 years before independence. They had started a state university in Lubumbashi, Elizabethville, about 58. And then in 59, the Protestants started this theology school with 3 professors and 3 students. That's the beginning. Congo independence, by July of 60, there is chaos, and a lot of the Belgians are fleeing the Congo and coming back to Congo, and they don't know what to do. So 1962, it was 3 years after they had started the theology school, 2 years after independence, it was quiet enough that the Congo Protestant Council, interesting, you had traditional Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, disciples of Christ, even so-called little faith missions were members of the Congo Protestant Council. They got along because they didn't emphasize theological statements. They said, no, we're coming together. We realize that there are many divergent interpretations. Let that go. You do what you want on your station, but we want to have one voice in dealing with the government. And so that's what they did. They said, in their statement as they founded the theological school, they said, we want to prepare pastors to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, period. So that was it. That was enough. All right. Now, by 62, Bokele Ali is chairman of the Congo Protestant Council. Bokele is a disciples product from the Bandaka area. So he talks to Ben Hobgood, who was one of the missionaries. In fact, Ben Hobgood was the son of a missionary who eventually had his biography in the Belgian academic circles because he translated the Bible. So he talks to Ben Hobgood. He says, Ben, we've got to change this theological school and add more departments and create a university. Now's the time. We're independent. We don't need to listen to the Belgians. We can do it. Ben says, no. Bokele Ali insists. And finally, Ben and Betsy say, okay, we'll do it. We'll see what we can do. But he didn't have a PhD. He couldn't be rector, not right away. And he got out of somebody. So they found Jim Decker, and Jim and June said, yeah, we'll go. They got some support from the U.S. government, and they were starting on there. And they said to Jim, come on, draft us some statement on what's involved to build a university. And you go back to the archives and you read he has a long paper on what's required to build a university, starting with students, professors, dormitories, classrooms, money, who pays for everything. Hey, you can't just decree tomorrow we have a university. But he ends his report by saying, if God be for us, who can prevail against us? Now that was the big thing. Ben says, let's see what we can do. They started publicizing, and they said in '63, only 4 years after they had started their theological school, we will start giving classes on the university level, and they didn't know whom they would get to teach. So they said, because UNESCO, Belgians, the Dutch were now interested because they were the Protestant leaders in the old time and the links to the Belgians next door. There were all of these ready to give some help, including the Canadians and other governments that were around there. They said, we can start this, okay? So they said, we'll have our first students in '64 in Stanleyville. There were empty buildings there that the government was giving to the university. And they said, we will start there with the classes and send your applications there. And in the meantime, they came to me and to Elfrida, and they said, you have your PhD. Would you now join us as academic dean? Well, in the meantime, Jim Decker, he had already gone to the Canadian embassy and said, hey, would you fund and finance this Canadian? Because we had no money. So they had to go around begging wherever they could. UNESCO, Canada, Belgians, the Dutch sent professors. We had UNESCO financing some professors. We had the Canadian government financing my going there. And we moved. In the summer of '64, we moved to Stanleyville. We were there only about 6 weeks when the rebels took over the city. Everything was blocked. We were caught in this place that had no access by sea or by the river. The river boats couldn't come. The airport was closed, and the outside roads were being blocked. So we were prisoners there for a while. In the meantime, both Jim and Ben, they were in Kinshasa, they came from vacation in October, they sent word out to the students, we'll have classes for you either here on the campus of the Catholic University or in the Loewen, where there are some facilities available there. That was the background. Finally, the following year, Jim had it. He got an appointment with the Ford or Rockefeller Foundation to work in Nigeria. He went over there. Elfrida and we were able to continue under the Canadian support, but we couldn't move back to Stanleyville because we had too many rebels right near the city still roaming around, We couldn't get back there till 67. And by the time we could get back there, there was another riot in Stanleyville, or not as much there, but actually in downtown Kinshasa, which scared the Canadians. And they said to me, no, we won't even support you. And we had to withdraw also. And this was in 67. Ben was left alone. So they were able to get some European to come for a year, but there was a Frenchman whose wife didn't even come. Then he never even hardly finished the year. Ben had to take over, and he ran the university till 71 in Stanleyville. Then the Congo government made a decision to nationalize the two religious universities, the Catholic and the Protestant. So they made them, they already had a state university in Lubumbashi, so they added these two and said, okay, this is now one university for the Congo with 3 campuses. And then 2 years later, they said to the theological school, get off campus, we don't need you anymore. And the theology school of Stanleyville didn't know what to do. In the meantime, they had tried all kinds of things in Stanleyville, including we had a professor there, a Baptist missionary, Dr. John Carrington, one of these universal scholars who could teach anything. He was an anthropologist, he knew biology and botany, he was a linguist, he was one of the few white people in the world that could send messages on talking drums, which is binary, ta 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 ta. And he went around giving lectures, and he could send messages to the village that could still hear him on an evening that was quiet. You could go about 6-7 kilometers. You could send a message, and then you would have somebody transmit it to the next village, and so on. Anyway, he was one. I remember asking John. I was then academic dean, and I said, John, boy, we need a physics prof here. Oh, he says, give me 2 weeks, I could teach physics. He was great. But we had that kind of a mixture of all kinds of people. But Olson started, Paul Olson's father started a medical school there. And by the time Mobutu took everything over from the religious universities, they had a university. That university is still running. But the Protestant theological school had to move off. Where do they go? So they decide, well, we could go back to Kinshasa, go back to the capital. So they found a few places where they could still continue teaching there. In the meantime, Bokele Ali, who was still then head of the Congo Protestant Council, had made contact again with the Germans. The Germans were interested now in helping the Congo. They had never been there. They had no German missions there. But the German foreign aid and Bread for the World, that kind of organization, they said, we would like to help. So Mobutu, the man who had nationalized the religious universities, Mobutu himself, to Bokele Ali, gave them a choice piece of land in the center of the city where they could build their cathedral. The Protestant cathedral can seat 6,000 people, and it was funded by the Germans. But there was enough land. I mean, there were almost no cars in those days for parking needed anyway. There was lots of land left over. The theological school set up a small campus there also, with several buildings financed by the Germans. So they went over to that, sat there, they started it, and then they ran it for several years in the 70s and 80s. But where was Jim, where was Ben, where was Mel Loewen? We were all gone. We had missed 20 years. Ben left in 71, Jim left in 65, I left in 67. In the meantime, we had other jobs. We were happily doing our things. We occasionally heard a few things about the theological school until 1991, and Mobutu changed his mind. Oh, he realized a few university campuses owned by the state wasn't nearly enough for this an enormous country. I better allow the religious communities to build their university. He changed the whole theme. And the Protestants under Ngoy, who was then heading one of the departments of the theology school, they said, hey, Congo Protestant Council, let's go back and build a university in Kinshasa, not Stanleyville, right here. And we think we have enough room right here to build a campus. So we said to ourselves, hey, we can build a campus. And the Germans again dropped in, and they said, sure, we'll build the first classroom buildings. Gradually, they moved along. The Swedes said, because the Swedish had a similar policy, where the European governments directly on foreign aid will attach to some organization, some church, some mission that has the feet on the ground. They can trust with the money. They deliberately work with those agencies. So if the church puts up 10%, 20%, government puts up 80%. Same thing happened with the Swedes as with the Germans. The Swedes built a 3-story library there, funded by them. And so they went on forward. All right, now we're in 91, 92. Here is Ben Hobgood. He is being called back from, during those 20 absent years, Ben did all kinds of college administration in North America, including Southern Methodist in Texas. But he is going into retirement. He goes back under the Presbyterians who called him back to Kinshasa for a year, and he sees his friend Ngoy, he sees the theological school, and Ngoy says to him, hey, Ben, we've got to have some support. We have some support from Europe. We have some support. We know that you North American missionaries would like to help us. Why don't you organize an organization in North America that will be support? Now, that's really the beginning of the discussion today. What's the history of the North American Liaison Bureau was the legal document that was first registered some 20 years in the state of Florida, and then more recently has changed its name, its operating name, to Education Congo, which is fair enough. Now, who would be the first supporters of this organization in North America? Ben doesn't know. Ben says, hey, wait a minute. Who is back of all this? The missionaries. So he calls up Jim, calls me up. He is himself in Florida. He calls up Charlie Stewart, the Williamsons. He calls up the Booths from Booth's father was a Methodist bishop in the Katanga area of the Congo, and he has these 6 families, 6 couples. That's the founding of what we now call Education Congo. But as he called us together, he said, okay, why don't we get a chairman, and I'll be the executive secretary, and I'll do the books for now. And I became chairman of that group for, must have been 7, 8, 9 years, until gradually others took over. But that also was a respect that he had, because Jim was rector for a couple of years. I was rector for a couple of years. My name is Mel Loewen. There's Jim Decker. There's Ben Hobgood. There are all these others that are involved. And Ben eventually, he stuck with it again and again and again. So if there is a hero in the history, I still say it's Ben. But us plebes, we were there too, and we were blessed by having him as a colleague. So what do we support? What does Ngoy need? Oh, he needs money and equipment and operating money. Well, we said, no, we will not send you money for operating. Neither salaries, nor water bill, nor electricity bill, or maintenance. No, because once you start that, and the electricity is cut off because your check didn't come in, the university crumbles. No, the operational money must come from local sources. So we said, the North American group will help you with scholarships. There are a lot of good, valid candidate students that have no force, no money, and you have a very low tuition fee, which is fair enough. You have almost no dormitories, so they can stay with relatives that are living in some part of Kinshasa, and you can start and keep building university. So we started with scholarships. That has been, you look again to the history of even American universities, like Harvard, Yale, Princeton. They all started as Bible schools. Gradually they became universities, and they had all kinds of scholarship money for the poor. That's exactly how our support group started. We had support for scholarships from the Netherlands, from Germany, from Switzerland. You had the same. Then over the years, even Lucy Hobgood in Australia got a support group going from there. Now, where does this Education Congo go? That first group of 6 couples is fading. Some are gone. Jim is gone. Ben and Betsy are gone. So gradually, we over the years, we added on Bokambas from Illinois, Losis from Georgia. We added the Cardwells, the Rosses. There were still ties either through the church or through teaching and others. Now, we've got, let's say in the Congo Protestant University, we now have 4 departments. We have the old theology school is still there with some 200 students, but by far most of the 8,000 students that are there annually are in economics, business economics field, in the law school, and now more recently in the medical school. Now, let's go back to the slogan, an education that builds a nation. It isn't just competence in economics or business. It isn't just competence in medicine. You need to build character. And this is one of the difficulties of having a campus that is a commuter campus. There are almost no students in residence. The students will come and they'll quickly take their class in law or economics and take the bus and go home again. There is very little teaching on character building, integrity. How do you become an entrepreneur? How do you do things and things fall apart? How do you become a person that loves his neighbor and loves his country? Where does this discussion happen? And I think one of the great contributions of Education Congo is to really look at the slogan again. Education to build a nation means building character, building love of country, building love of nature, neighbors. Actually, you are competent in your field of law and business. However, what's your character? And how do you build a nation? That discussion has to be on campus. And if God be for us, who can prevail against us?